The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com. Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Steve Kazella, president of the MassINC Polling Group, here with Jennifer Smith, reporter for Commonwealth Beacon, and it is Thursday, October 9th. Today, we are talking about re-election prospects, specifically Ed Markey's re-election prospects and what voters are thinking about them. Then we'll be joined by our good friend Rich Parr, who's talking about two new surveys that have been done, one on competitiveness of Massachusetts and the other on housing in Boston and how those two things relate. Hey, Jen.
Hey, Steve. How are things in your neck of the woods? Is Kenya shut down?
Kenya is not shut down. The government here is functioning as much as it ever does.
All right. Well, that is my very unsubtle segue into noting we are recording. It is October 8th. The government is still shut down in these here United States. There's been plenty of reporting about just what a mess that's been for folks already. One that stuck out to me was the EPA workers in the Boston Federal Environmental Protection Agency facility who just may not be getting paid, but may be expected to work, but aren't necessarily essential workers. So there's a lot of weird confusion happening around some essential workers and some federal workers. It seems like Logan Airport is holding together, but of course, those essential workers will not be paid until after the shutdown ends. So just a reminder, folks working during the shutdown are not being paid during the shutdown. And the reason I bring this up is because, bafflingly, to me at least, the president suggested that not all federal workers should get back pay, which is required by law. He said it, quote, depends on who we're talking about, and that some of the 750,000 employees who are foregoing pay to work through the shutdown, quote, don't deserve to be taken care of. So that is the background, and that is the position of the president. I don't really know what we're all supposed to do with that, but if you're wondering how we ended up in this situation, we talked about that last week. Steve, for now, I guess we're assuming the government won't still be shut down in 2026, and that's why we're talking about midterms?
I mean, it's hard, nobody knows how long these things will last, and it does often seem like nothing's solved until everything's solved, and, these deals that have ended past shutdowns kind of come out of nowhere. It also, as many have noted, feels different this time and is different in some ways, and you don't have kind of universal agreement that we all ought to follow the clear letter of the law on reopening or on other issues, so how that factors into any sort of deal that might be made is also hard to say, but certainly a lot of ambiguity for federal workers, federal agencies, and just really hard to see where this goes from here.
Yeah, it's been a stumper, and of course everyone's kind of gritting their teeth and bearing through it. And I think one note on the subject of why this feels a little bit different is there was a decision this time to walk into the shutdown to specifically try and negotiate over healthcare. So that feels different. It's not just that everybody is trying to get out of it as quickly as possible. There's ongoing negotiations. So all of that in mind, in the back of your head. So we're talking midterms. We're talking 2026 because after fending off his last challenge, it looks like Senator Ed Markey could be staring down another. We already talked about Representative Seth Moulton's remarks that he is not thinking about running statewide. Rep. Ayanna Pressley's name is flying around, and so are the polls. So Steve Casella, if you were trying to assess the strength of an incumbent Massachusetts senator, what would you be looking for?
Usually you wouldn't have to look at almost anything. Like the only Massachusetts senator in any recent memory that's lost, of course, has been Scott Brown, and his victory was a bit of a oddball. So like that is not terribly surprising. He was the first and only Republican in quite a long time from Massachusetts to be elected to either the House or the Senate. So when the Democrats kind of pulled themselves together and fielded a candidate, which of course is now Senator Elizabeth Warren, things turned around for the Democrats. So now Ed Markey is facing re-election in 2026, and the numbers that I would look at for him are a bit unique because the situation is a bit different than it's been in the past. Like conventional ones to look at would be things like his job approval. How many people approve versus how many people disapprove of the job he's doing. Favorability, the same thing. Do people think favorably or unfavorably of him? And then you would look at his reelect number. Does he deserve reelection, or is it time to give someone else a chance? But there's one other question which has become pertinent in recent years and is particularly pertinent to Ed Markey, which is age. It's just this huge issue that we can't ignore and which is out there in the public realm on all kinds of candidates, particularly for Democrats. And Ed Markey is going to be 80 when he runs for re-election. Not when he's done with his term. On Election Day in 2026, that will be Ed Markey's age.
That's right. And so we've talked about this a little bit before in the past, which is that there is still some disagreement among Democrats about whether or not there should essentially be kind of a pressure campaign or an expectation that at a certain age level, folks do retire. We all remember what the year of whether or not Ruth Bader Ginsburg would step down from the Supreme Court felt like. We've seen several Democrats die in office in recent years, especially this year. But let's go back just a little bit, Steve, because looking at the polling, because we're going to look at how it evolves over time, the questions that people are interested in, how folks are responding. We started off the year with some February polling from UMass Amherst, looking at Massachusetts adults and asked, do you approve or disapprove of the way an array of people were doing their job? And that included Senators Markey and Warren here. So what stands out to you thinking back to February before anyone specifically was being floated as a challenge when you're examining
these? I mean, his numbers look fine, and his numbers have always looked fine on job approval, have always looked fine, if not spectacular on favorability. Like, it's not like people don't like him. One of his problems has been that people have forgotten who he is for substantial portions of his times in office, where, you just, or just didn't have a view of him. It wouldn't be like, I've never heard of him, but it would be like, yeah, I know who Ed Markey is, but I don't have either a favorable or an unfavorable view of him. So at the time in February, he had 51% approve and 29% disapprove, right about in the same range as Elizabeth Warren, a little bit higher in terms of the numbers saying that they were unsure about Ed Markey. So again, not bad numbers really, but that's really not the problem that he's going to face in 2026, is that people think he's done a bad job or they don't like him as a person. It's going to be that they think it's time for somebody else.
All right, so let's get into these most recent numbers. What stood out to you this week?
Right. So there are two polls that I have been looking at this week. The first comes from the Fiscal Alliance Foundation. And those polls often have, long batteries of issue stuff that we don't talk about a lot just because they're often worded in ways that don't really, I just don't want to talk about them as far as like measures of the issues that they're looking at. But they do a pretty good job of looking at the election numbers, the politics numbers. How's Ed Markey doing? How's Elizabeth Warren, Maura Healey, and so forth. So they asked the question, Senator Ed Markey has announced his intention to run for re-election in 2026 for another 6-year term. He will be 80 years old in 2026. Do you think Ed Markey should seek re-election? So there's a couple things about that question. Number one is it puts age front and center, which the re-elect questions then come after that. That's not great. That's not a great methodology. What you'd like to do really is ask the questions about him versus Seth Moulton, him versus Ayanna Pressley, and then something about age, just because otherwise what you've basically done is you've made the whole thing about age, because that's what's in people's minds then when they're answering the questions about Seth Moulton and Ayanna Pressley running against him. But with all that as a wind-up, on that first question, they found 36% said yes, and 46% said no, he should not run for office. And then when following that question, he was matched up in a hypothetical matchup among Democrats against Seth Moulton and Ayanna Pressley. He trailed Seth Moulton by 8 points, and he trailed Ayanna Pressley by, I should never do math while I'm recording, by, let's say 2 points. They round to the hundredths of digits, or the hundredths place. So I'm trying to round and trying to subtract hundredths and see what rounds to two.
Really exciting watching you do that.
Markey trails Pressley by a couple points. So, not doing what you'd think an incumbent should be doing in a primary against either one.
So one of the questions, whenever I see kind of a Fiscal Alliance Foundation poll, and of course we know, it's a more conservative leaning group. That's sort of what we're alluding to when we're talking about the phrasing of some of these issue questions. So one thing that comes to mind here that we were hearing little kind of burblings about is, is this essentially something akin to a push poll? Like, is this something that we'd be looking at as a way to specifically test the waters or establish that there would be demand for a more moderate candidate like Seth Moulton, for instance? So when you see this kind of result, this kind of targeted testing, how does that sort of hit you initially?
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't want to rely on it only for exactly the reasons you just outlined. And respondents to this poll had also just come through a very long series of questions with lots of wording that was very loaded. So you'd want to then take this survey and look at other surveys. We don't have tons of them. We don't have tons of them that have asked these specific questions, but we do have a recent UNH poll, University of New Hampshire poll, that also does surveys here in Massachusetts. And they asked a more basic question. Generally speaking, do you think Ed Markey deserves to be reelected as a U.S. Senator? And they found 42% said yes and 39% said no. So, that's about split. That's not terrific. And the reason that that number stood out to me is because independents are a bigger and bigger and bigger portion of the overall electorate here in Massachusetts. And they found Ed Markey with 28% of independents saying yes, he does deserve, 52% saying no. The reason that that matters in a primary is because, of course, independents in Massachusetts can vote in either primary and are making up larger and larger shares of the Democratic primaries. So you can do well among Democrats, but it's becoming more and more important that you're also doing well among independents.
And help me out here because whenever we talk about this stuff, I often come at it from a wording perspective as well, which is like, what's going on with deserve to be reelected? So that's not quite the same language as would you vote for him if he was on your ballot? It's not, should he retire? It's the question of deserve to be reelected. It seems to me like that's a little bit of a complicated way to put it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And it's one of these questions that's been around forever in basically two forms. One is the one that UNH asked, deserve to be reelected versus does not deserve to be reelected. The other one that you'll often see get used is does so-and-so deserve to be reelected or is it time to give someone else a chance?
Right.
And there's no particular reason why those questions are better than any others that you might ask about somebody's impending electoral prospects. I mean, the virtue of them in one sense is that you don't have to have another candidate. You can ask that question before you know whether they have a Democrat or Republican running against them. But they're not, you note their weaknesses for sure. What does deserve mean? Like, have you passed a bill? Have you gotten arrested in an ICE protest? Like, how do you even think of that? And do I make my decisions based on who deserves to be reelected versus just who they're going to vote for speaker or, Senate president? So, it is a tough question, but it does have a long history. And certainly that's not a great number to have.
Right. Well, but one thing that's also interesting is that it's better than it was earlier this year. In May, it was only a third of those polled said that he deserved to be reelected, and now it's at 42%. And of course, what has happened in the interim has been kind of a very disruptive period of federal policy. Ed Markey has been pretty out there opposing specific Trump administration priorities. So when you see a jump of almost 10 points, it's still not a majority of folks that say he deserves to be reelected. But is that an upward trajectory, or is that just demonstrating that people were a little bit inattentive and now they're more attentive?
It certainly is the direction Ed Markey wants to see it move for that exact reason. As people tune in and the salience of the election starts to grow, you want your numbers to be headed in that direction rather than in the other direction. And it's none of this is to say at all that Ed Markey can't be reelected. He definitely can be reelected. The question will be whether he can convince Democrats and enough independents that he can stick around, and that he not just has the fight in him, which has become a very important issue to Democrats, but also that he will, not to be morbid, but will survive for another 6 years. we mentioned Scott Brown earlier, and I think it's worth noting that he became senator because a senator from Massachusetts died in office. It's a bit of history for the youngins who listen to this podcast. Like, it may be hard to remember, but Democrats had 60 votes in the Senate for a brief moment when Barack Obama was first elected. And then Ted Kennedy died in office, and then they had 59 and lost the filibuster-proof majority that they had before, which would have let them pass a much different version of Obamacare than they ended up having to pass because Scott Brown came from Massachusetts instead of Ted Kennedy. So, like, the impact of one senator, one, well-aged, well-cured senator from Massachusetts has been very significant in the very recent past.
And then thinking about the alternative here, for instance, so the folks that have been floated, so Moulton and Presley, those are both inside the party. That's not a matter of saying, does Massachusetts seem like it's gonna elect a Scott Brown again? And I think the closest maybe we came to this was earlier polling on if Charlie Baker was bored and wanted to run for U.S. Senate. How would people feel about a historically popular governor there? Did that feel at the time like a sort of useful metric? Does it inform how you're thinking about Seth Moulton's odds as opposed to Ayanna Pressley's odds?
I mean, that one was, we did ours before, Charlie Baker appeared to close and lock and deadbolt the door to running in 2026. But what it showed me, finding Charlie Baker at that time with a 6-point edge, was just that Ed Markey doesn't really have a lock on it. That's not to say that Ed Markey can't win. He definitely can. But it's just another indication that there are openings. There are openings within the Democratic Party. It's hard to see like a Republican who will vote for Republicans right now in Massachusetts winning statewide office, particularly for the Senate where, the balance is so close and so forth. But I think it just shows that there's interest, there's interest in something else for that Senate seat.
Yeah, it is interesting because one of the things that comes to mind, of course, is in the last challenge to Markey by then Congressman Joe Kennedy III, one of the major issues was, how much space is in between these two people's policy platforms, and that it basically came down to knocking Kennedy because of kind of his family associations and some discrepancies on the policy side of it. So it is interesting because it might be much harder for someone who has also positioned themselves as a progressive in Massachusetts to then bump the sitting incumbent senator, as much as it might then clear open some space for a more moderate candidate to pick up whatever is left. So those sorts of dynamics are always very interesting because we do not have, of course, ranked choice voting or anything like that. So you get what you get. And so that can often be a reason to either encourage an older candidate to step down or to discourage a younger candidate from stepping in, lest they end up ceding what is seen as the kind of more progressive, or in a different congressional seat or a different state or something like that, a more conservative or more moderate position to someone who might not do as well in a general. So I'm very interested in that dynamic because as of when we're recording, neither Ayanna Pressley nor Seth Moulton has said they are definitely running for this seat.
Right. Seth Moulton is not running. But we want to leave you listeners here with one interesting stat, which we found while researching this segment, which is that Ed Markey is now the 11th longest serving member of Congress in the history of the United States at 48 years and 340 days. And if you fast forward that, basically 7 years, so 1 year until election and another 6-year term, then he would be between the third and fourth longest serving senators or longest serving members of either house in the history of the United States. So there
Look
you go.
at that. All right. Well, we love some trivia, and I think we'll have to leave that there to talk about how the state itself is doing. And that brings us to our next segment, covering count them, two recent polls conducted by our very own MassINC Polling Group. So the first looks at how Massachusetts residents think the state at large is stacking up against other states and why. And the second goes deep into one of the problems holding Massachusetts back from that alleged success compared to other states: housing. especially housing in the biggest city in New England, which is Boston. If you're wondering, the biggest city of New England is Boston. And so we're going to be talking about that with the delightful Rich Parr, Vice President of the MassINC Polling Group. Rich, welcome back to the program from Western Massachusetts to talk about Eastern.
Yes, thank you very much. I was in the biggest city in New England this past weekend for a concert. It was lovely.
Incredible. And you looked around and you thought, man, the people in this city really want more housing.
Well, I noticed actually that there was a lot more housing had been built since I had last been there, and had particularly had been resident in the Alston Brighton neighborhood. That neighborhood is completely transformed. But yeah, it seems like we keep building and building, but this issue continues to pop up in people's minds. So
yeah, and I think that's probably the best way to actually start with the statewide look here, which is, so there was a survey that you folks did for the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, and that's as a companion to their competitiveness index that they put together every year, looking at how Massachusetts stacks up against other states, not just other happy blue New England states, but also everywhere else in the country. What do we do well? What do we do poorly? What do we even mean when we talk about competitiveness? So I think that's going to be the lead in here. Rich, what do we need to know about how we measure competitiveness?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Mass Taxpayers is this really impressive piece of work every year where they're going into all of the minutia of education data, economic data, how much are people saving? How much debt do people have? Like, what's the per capita GDP? But, that's all really useful and helpful. But if you think about it, a lot of competitiveness is perception is reality, right? If you think a place is good at something, you might be inclined to go there for it. So we thought that it would be a good idea to pair the super wonky competitiveness index with a survey. And so what we did is we went out and we talked to Massachusetts residents. We asked them, where do you think Massachusetts ranks both in terms of quality of life as a place to live and then as a place to do business? And we actually found that, Massachusetts does pretty well on both marks. I think it's not super surprising. We tend to get rated in a lot of these surveys as one of the best places to live, but actually the business competitiveness was not that far off. It was a little bit lower, but overall we had majority saying we were above average on both of them, and we had about 10 points more people saying that that we're one of the best states to live in, and a little bit lower on that mark for the business competitiveness.
So that kind of question of the best states to live in, what were you sort of hoping to capture with that question? What do you think people understood that to sort of mean?
Yeah, we asked some follow-ups on that. Like what are the things that you think Massachusetts does well? What do you think are the things that Massachusetts does poorly? And the things that came up again and again, and they came up on later questions in the survey as well, are healthcare and education. Those are kind of that's our brand. If
Meds and eds, baby.
Meds and eds, but higher ed, but also K through 12 ed. So one of the things that really stood out when we got to the breakdown questions, where we let's pick apart this whole quality of life thing into its constituent elements. The quality of healthcare and public health services was the thing that we were rated best at, and then that was followed by the quality of the K through 12 education system. And we asked about higher ed, but more in the context of business competitiveness, because that is a source of our talent pool, right, for businesses to come here. But those are the only two things on the quality of life breakout where we were really knocking it out of the park. We're kind of middle of the pack on childcare. We're a little bit below average on commute times, and we're very much below average on cost of living and the cost and availability of housing. So, which I don't think would be a surprise to most people who are living here or are familiar with public opinion surveys, but it's really interesting if you kind of look at the numbers. It's like that education and healthcare stuff is really kind of dragging everyone else along, right? It's the thing that is kind of responsible for the bulk of our high ratings and our high self-regard in terms of our rankings with other states.
Well, and this is also really interesting in the context of the last time you and I chatted on the podcast, Rich, was about the healthcare polling that you folks had done for Commonwealth. And that, again, people thought that the state did very well compared to other states, not just in terms of quality of healthcare, but even though we know that we have some of the more expensive healthcare in the country, people were also kind of inclined to say, well, it it's probably about as good here or bad here as it is anywhere else, which I think kind of nails into your sort of perception is reality point. But what I think would be helpful to kind of probe into here is not every demographic group feels the same way about Massachusetts. So there's still, a kind of a high level of regard that we're either one of the best states to live in or above average to live in. But that does change depending on where you live, how much money you make, and how educated you are. So who's happiest with Massachusetts?
Yes, this is a pattern that we saw in the healthcare polling. I've seen it in other polling recently as well. And it really is kind of reinforcing in my mind this sense of like, who is Massachusetts good for, right? Because it's the higher education, higher income folks who tend to live in Boston itself or maybe in its immediate suburbs. That you can kind of picture that this is a little bit of a bubble within the bubble of Massachusetts, of folks who are quite well off, who can afford to live in that part of the state, and have good enough education, probably have good enough jobs to be able to afford all of this, and they think everything's awesome, right? And then as you get farther out from there, you get to lower income segments or people who have less degrees of education, getting out into the western part of the state, the southeastern part of the state, it really kind of falls off a little bit too. I should say that out in these other regions, there are still strong numbers, but there's a pretty big drop off. So just for example, if you live in Suffolk County, if you live in Boston, 44% of the folks in this survey think that we're one of the best places to live in America. And then if you get down to the southeastern part of the state, it's 22%. So it drops by half. It's 23% where I live in the western part of the state. It's 23% in the central part of the state. So, there's a pretty significant drop off there. And similarly, if you look at something like education, the most educated people in this survey, 45% of them are like, this is one of the best places to live. If you only have a high school degree or less, only 20% of those people say that. So really kind of a very stark kind of dropping off as you kind of descend the education, the income ladders, and then also as you move further away from Boston across the state.
I think that really squares as well of what you saw in the breakdowns of what we do well or poorly compared to other states on, where if, for instance, you're outside of kind of the main college town areas, the main biotech areas, if you are struggling to find housing or afford housing, it makes a lot of sense that since some of the major issues that respondents brought up was, overall cost of living, we are not doing great on that. Cost and availability of housing, we are not doing great on that. So if you're at those kind of lower income levels or not in those very kind of highly educated high-tech careers that tend to be centered around the Boston area, it makes a lot of sense that Massachusetts might have less to offer you than another state. I guess the last thing that I wanted to hit on competitiveness here is, having done this survey and thinking about it in connection with this broader competitiveness ranking, we hear a lot of discussion in the state about, well, what does the average person understand competitiveness to mean? Is it literally, in fact, the estate tax level? Is it capital gains tax? Is that why people think Massachusetts might be better or worse than any other place here? So how are these results squaring with the kind of objection to Massachusetts being that, in fact, the kind of tax policy is too restrictive?
I mean, you do see that come up a little bit in the list of things that we're not good at, right? So we ask people, what are the things that are competitive advantages? What are the things that are our competitive disadvantages? But it's not the top thing. I mean, really, it's more the experience of living here and the cost of living here are the things that that are driving those kind of negative perceptions. And I think that, to some extent, higher taxes could be a part of that cost equation for a certain segment of the population, but it's a pretty small segment of the population, right? I mean, if we're talking about the millionaires tax, that is only hitting millionaires. We don't have enough millionaires in your typical survey to be able to really parse those out beyond that level. But the competitive weaknesses are taxes, and cost and inequality, and then housing, and then transportation. Those were the kind of the top weaknesses when we ask people in an open-ended sense to kind of just go off and say, well, tell us what we're bad at, right? So yeah, taxes is up there. There is that perception of Taxachusetts. I think so much of this, again, with the positive stuff, it's our brand, and with our negative stuff, it's our brand as well, right? And
right.
brands can be very sticky. So the idea of Meds and Eds on the plus side and Taxachusetts on the negative side are really coming through very clearly, I think. It'd be interesting if we did this survey outside of Massachusetts and just asked people to rank all of the states, and would that perception from the outside be the same as what we have it on the inside? But I think it's pretty baked in at this point among most people that we're sort of a high cost, high tax state, but you really get some good services for it. And if you can afford it, it's a great place to be.
I'm really now holding out for the MassINC Polling Group survey of every New England state except for Massachusetts, right. Just asking, what do you think of them out there?
The donut hole survey. I like that.
Exactly. But it is actually a good transition here to the other poll that you recently completed, which is the exact opposite of everywhere in New England except for Massachusetts. It is looking very narrowly at housing in the city of Boston. So tell me about that.
Yes. So this was the second survey that we've done this year for a group called Abundant Housing Massachusetts. I believe there are abundant housing chapters in many different states, but this is just the Massachusetts one. And we had done a statewide survey some time ago asking about policy and, how much of a problem people think housing is in their communities and for the state as a whole. And we decided to do this just in Boston to really kind of drill down on Boston and see what's going on there. And, in Boston's defense, there has been a lot of building. There are pro-housing policies that are happening. The Wu administration is turning high rises into housing or offering incentives to do that sort of thing. But we wanted to see, is that really moving the needle for people, or is the problem still acute?
Yes, so abundant housing is the state's main YIMBY group. So kind of the yes in my backyard, build housing at all income or market rate levels. The idea that if you're building more housing, of course, it's relieving pressure on the market so it becomes more affordable to live in overall, rather than a kind of targeted focus on affordable housing as kind of an income restricted concept. So that's where you might see some differences between some different housing approaches. Like, this isn't saying rent control specifically, it's saying build more housing, make it easier to build more housing everywhere. So let's get into what the actual results are with that sort of framing, that this is an organization that's looking to kind of make the case that there is a need and an appetite for more pro-housing policy and more housing in general across the city to address kind of the basic affordability questions. So did Boston as a whole go, yeah, sure, totally, I agree with that? Or were they like, we're good, actually, it's extremely affordable to live here and we have plenty of houses?
Yeah, I would sum this poll up in three ways. There is a problem. It is really having an impact on people. We asked a question about, is this kind of hitting your own pocketbook? And if you're a renter, the answer is very much so, yes. And people support doing something about it. They want to see some of those pro-housing policies that you were just talking about. And again, this is a YIMBY group. This is a group that is focused mostly on the supply side, right, of housing. Like, build some more houses, and then hopefully that'll bring the cost down. Those are the sorts of policies that we tested in here. So, but just to start with framing the problem, 73%, 3/4 of the folks in this survey are telling us that they think that housing costs in the city are a major problem, right? So that is like the top of the four scale, the four option scale. We're talking about a major problem here, 73%. A similar number are giving the city only fair to poor marks on actually addressing that problem. So they're seeing it's a problem. They're not really seeing enough action from the city on this. And they're seeing it in their own neighborhoods. We found that a plurality or a majority are telling us that there are actually fewer homes available to rent or buy in the city than 4 years ago, ranging from 56% of people saying that in Hyde Park, Mattapan, Roxbury, down to 38% saying that in JP, West Roxbury, Roslindale. So maybe there's something going on where some neighborhoods are seeing some new housing and it is getting a little bit better, but there's a lot of places where that housing isn't really coming in yet. So folks are really seeing that this is still an issue. Renters are telling us that it's making it harder for them to afford to buy a home, that they're making it's harder for them to live in the neighborhood they want to live in, which I think is super interesting. That you might be stuck in a neighborhood of Boston, you might want to go to another place, but you can't because there's nowhere for you to buy something. So it's a problem in the abstract for the entire city, and it's also, we're hearing, a problem for folks who are, just renting and trying to be able to afford their first home or maybe move to another part of the city. It's just becoming unaffordable for them to have that kind of mobility.
And I think the thing to leave on that I'm particularly interested here in is I'm going to put my kind of local Boston reporter hat on. And whenever there is discussion about how much people sort of recognize that there is a problem and then where they'd like to see kind of the solution to that problem manifest, basically. You might say, well, we need to build more density. We might need more housing in general. Yes, in theory, I might not like the idea of a parking minimum, meaning that you couldn't build something downtown or something like that. Doesn't necessarily translate into approval or enthusiasm for building in kind of their own neighborhood, the sort of classic NIMBY thing. So given that this is a poll that is oriented at how people think the city of Boston is doing, what were your major takeaways in terms of how people seemed to feel about kind of specific action items? Because it didn't, I think, if I'm recalling correctly, ask, do you say want 12 stories right next to your local T-stop? But it said, are you okay with the idea of 12 stories next to a T-stop? Is that right?
That's true. I mean, we did run people through a kind of a series of policy questions, and they do include, like, let's build taller, right? Let's have 6-story residential buildings as opposed to the kind of the 3-deckers that everybody knows and loves.
I'll fight you. I'm in a 3-decker right now, Rich.
Yes, I lived in a 3-decker when I lived in the city as well. So we're talking about things like upzoning, increasing the heights, increasing densities up to 12 stories near T-stops, right? More flexibility for parking, allowing ADUs in Boston. I did not know this until I worked on this survey, that the statewide law that allowed ADUs across the state did not apply to Boston. Boston is still under its own special rules. So that would actually be a policy change that could affect Boston if you allowed people to build these ADU units in their, very small yards. Most of Boston does not have a lot of space for these sorts of things. Updating the zoning code for more housing. All of these things get a majority, at least somewhat supporting them. And then the strong support ranges from 54% down to 38%, right? So these are pretty popular ideas. What I would say about the neighborhood thing is we did ask a couple of questions that sort of pose the classic NIMBY concerns. Protecting the character of the neighborhood, or making sure that the downtown neighborhood association gets their concerns addressed in the new proposal. These are things that come up all the time when there's a new project that wants to be built. And what we found is that if you pit that concern versus the imperative of let's build some more housing, let's bring the cost down, overwhelmingly people across the city in different neighborhoods are saying, yeah, we need to build more housing. It's really not even close. It's more than a 2-to-1 margin pretty much across the board for people saying that we need to be actually prioritizing the building here and maybe prioritizing the neighborhood concerns a little bit less.
Yeah, that really stood out to me, even in some areas where, like, JP or West Roxbury or Roslindale, which have a little bit more of those sort of like suburban feels to them, even within the city, they were right there with everybody else, actually a little bit less interested in satisfying the concerns of neighborhood associations than some of the other neighborhoods. So really, really interesting stuff. But sadly, this is all the time we have to talk about polling and why it is so expensive to live here in Massachusetts and in Boston. So from my 3-decker to you out there in Western Massachusetts, thanks, Rich.
You're welcome. Talk to you later.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the MassINC Polling Group. The MassINC Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massincpolling.com.
And that brings us to our final segment, which this week is brought to you by our apparently disinterested in Halloween Salem department. Steve, we have both spent the last few minutes reading a completely befuddling New York Post article about Halloween fanatics. Why do you have that look on your face?
Yes, Jen, this article is from the long string of deeply scientific surveys that we here on the Horse Race have brought to our listeners because we love you, but actually hold you in secret contempt. Otherwise, we wouldn't do this to you. This survey, reported in the New York Post and done by Haichu. Sorry. I tried to say that with a straight face. I got so close. Done by Haichu. Actually, it was conducted by Talker Research on behalf of Haichu. The survey explored how Americans across the country snack and celebrate during the spookiest times of year. And they asked a series of questions about Halloween, what you do, how you think about it, and so forth. And then, among other things, ranked which states are basically the biggest fans of Halloween. So, drum roll, please. The top three were North Dakota, Delaware, and Idaho, actually, who, according to this deeply scientific survey, love Halloween the most, followed by Alabama, California, Iowa, New Hampshire, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Wyoming. Massachusetts is not mentioned in the article.
Not
at all.
Not there. Literally not there. The way that when I saw we're talking about the most obsessed with Halloween states, I immediately thought, man, you can't take a certain branch of the commuter rail in October because Massachusetts gets so obsessed with Halloween. And that is because, of course, of Salem. Wherever Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll is right now, I hope she is enjoying her Halloween festivities as former mayor of Salem. I hope she is dressed as a witch or a pumpkin or whatever she wants to be right now. But apparently we don't rank, but Idaho does.
That's right. We just don't care about Halloween. They did actually have some interesting stats in here, which is that the average American purchases 4.5 bags of candy, with most opting for a large or party size, which is more than 20 ounces. So if you imagine every American adult doing a little math, buying basically somewhere between 80 and 100 ounces of candy, you can see why we have dental problems, dental and obesity problems.
That's crazy. That is so, so wild. I'm literally just out here going, yes, chocolatey candy is the most popular. It's 86% of them. But then I'm also out here going, what is going on with Utah being specifically most likely to opt for chewy candy?
Yeah,
I don't recall this.
I was going to say that's your home turf. I wouldn't know anything about that.
Yeah, I don't know.
They did have some other things in here, like New Yorkers, according to, again, this deeply scientific survey that couldn't possibly be wrong, carve the most pumpkins per year at 3.5. People from Arkansas and New Jersey dedicate the most time to perfecting their costumes. Yeah, I don't know. This whole thing is a bunch of... I mean, if you can't even bring yourself to mention Salem and Massachusetts in an article about Halloween, I have trouble taking the survey seriously.
I'm
which I was
really
already having.
Devastated. No, exactly. If there's any remaining listener who's listening to this and just going, I mean, Steve must be thrilled to have a poll of this caliber in front of him to dive into, you might be listening to the wrong podcast.
Right, exactly. I mean, if anybody has access to the raw data from Haichu and wants to tell us where Massachusetts ranks, we will bring a follow-up report to this here podcast with Massachusetts official rankings, won't we?
That is exactly right. I do love that every time we talk about an unscientific poll, you make an earnest plea. If anyone knows how they got these numbers, please tell me. I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this in good faith. So, that request is out there. If you would like to, maybe don't send us suspicious candy, but definitely send us suspicious candy data. But I think that's where we got to leave it, Steve, before we start soliciting Halloween participation that we in Massachusetts are not entitled to.
It is where we have to leave it, unfortunately. Do send us that data. You know where to find us. That is all the time we have for today. I'm Steve Cazella, signing off with Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cazella. You can write to us at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com if you have data or crosstabs from the Haichu study. Don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download and reach out to us here at the MassINC Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. For now, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.